The first thing I remember is the taste of bad alcohol and cobblestones. Not my alcohol, I should add. Other people's. The night pressed in close, the way it does in the back streets of Ankh-Morpork, smelling of smoke, sewage, and cheap possibility. I woke up face down in a puddle that had definitely seen better days, and discovered that my skull was trying to leave my body through both temples at once. That, I later learned, was appropriate. When you are the god of hangovers, you do not get to wake gently. You come into existence at the exact point where merriment turns sour, and the human body starts to renegotiate its relationship with reality. I was born not out of love or prayer, but out of a collective, agonized groan. I did not know any of that in the first moments. I only knew that every bell in the city seemed to be ringing inside my head, and that my stomach had adopted a strong moral stance against everything I had never drunk. If you will, walk beside me for a while through those filthy alleys and the strange corridors of memory. I will show you how a small, ridiculous god found himself standing on the edge of a very large disaster on a Hogswatchnight, when the world nearly forgot its own story. Later, storytellers would speak of death in a red suit, a governess with eyes like flint, assassins and auditors, and a sky that almost did not brighten. I saw much of it in my stumbling way, but it began for me with vomit, confusion, and an urgent need for a name. I rolled onto my back and stared up at a strip of winter sky framed by leaning rooftops. Snow fell in slow, reluctant flakes, already turning grey as they met the breath of the city. Somewhere, distant bells marked the turning of the hour. Each note drove a tiny nail into my skull. I groaned and discovered, with a sort of detached interest, that the sound echoed oddly, as if my throat was deeper than it ought to be. The alley wall at my side was decorated with symbols. Some were the usual things people scratch when the drink is cheap and the evening's long. Others shimmered faintly, the way heat does above a forge. I did not know how I knew that the glowing ones were prayers, but I did. Scribbled bargains, desperate promises, pleas for the pain to stop and for the world to hold still, if only until morning. Every scratched plea tugged at me. They pulled on my nerves like harp strings, all set to the same discordant note. I understood, dimly, that these were mine. Their suffering belonged to me now. I was the answer no one really meant to ask for. I sat up, slowly, hand to my pounding head, and looked down at myself. Clothes, of a sort, stale with the smell of spilled beer and disappointment. Bare feet, no pockets, no helpful card pinned to my chest explaining who I was or where I ought to be returned. From the mouth of the alley, the city murmured. Hogswatch decorations blazed in shop windows, fat candles and fir wreaths and wooden Hogfathers with painted smiles. Children's voices rose and fell in excited shrieks. Somewhere, a street choir mangled a carol. None of it made my head hurt less, but all of it called to me in a way I could not explain. I staggered toward the noise, drawn by something larger than curiosity. With every step, a little more of the world slid into place. Names floated up. Ankh-Morpork, Hogswatchnight, Hogfather. The last one landed in my mind like a dropped stone in a pond. For a moment, the ripples cleared my vision. The Hogfather, the fat man in red, the one they left food out for, the one they wrote letters to, the one who laughed and gave gifts and watched from the rooftops. Even I, new as I was, could feel the shape of him in the city's imagination. A vast, comforting presence woven out of sugar, snow, and the need to believe that someone kindly was in charge of at least one night of the year. And underneath that shape, something was wrong. It is hard to describe the absence of a thing you have never seen. It was like walking into a tavern and feeling the silence where the piano should be. Like reaching out in the dark for a hand that has always been there and finding only cold air. The Hogfather's outline was still etched into people's minds. Children still waited. Adults still wrote lists they pretended were for the children. The rituals were all in place. But the centre was thin. I leaned against a lamppost, breathing hard, while the realization soaked through the fog of my own misery. For reasons far above my pay grade, the Hogfather was missing. And because the universe loathes a vacuum even more than it loathes sobriety, something else had been forced into existence to balance the trembling scales. Me. You may think this is a grand origin for a god, even a small one. To be born on the night when belief itself was buckling and entropy had taken an unhealthy interest in festive traditions. I can assure you, at street level, it felt less like destiny and more like punishment. Yet, even then, in the ache and confusion, there was a thin, insistent thread of awareness. People needed the Hogfather, not just for the presents or the sausages or the excuse to drink too much, though those helped. They needed the story, the shape he gave to midwinter, the reassurance that the dark would not have the last word. And if that story failed, if belief in Hogswatch's jolly lie faltered, what else might fail with it? But we still wonder whether the little myths we half mock and half treasure are really so small at all, or whether they are the first fragile scaffolding we build against the long cold night. If you had asked me on that first shivering night who might save Hogswatch, I would not have chosen a governess. One imagines heroes in armour or robes, not in sensible black with chalk dust on the cuffs. Yet the universe has its own taste in champions, and that winter it chose Susan Sto Helit, who did not believe in monsters and therefore was obliged to deal with them personally. I did not meet her at once. At the beginning I felt her only as a disturbance, like the way sound moves differently when someone opens a door in the next room. Susan's life, at that point, was a disciplined thing. She had arranged it carefully so that nothing inexplicable could creep in around the edges. She taught the children of a wealthy family in a nursery large enough to raise a small army. Toys lined the shelves, books sat in neat rows, and a strict timetable governed arithmetic, reading and music. Outwardly, it looked like a little kingdom of order carved out of the larger Ankh-Morpork chaos. The children, of course, knew better. They knew about the thing in the cellar that lurked behind the coal scuttle, the shadow that did not quite match its owner in the playroom corner, the whisper in the wardrobe that came only when the fire had burned low. Normally these things stayed on the far side of imagination, like stray dogs pacing a fence. But that Hogswatch they began to press closer. The absence where the Hogfather should have been left space, and anything with claws of belief tried to grow into it. The boy, very solemn and very frightened, told Susan there was a monster under his bed. Every governess manual would have advised patient reassurance. Susan lifted the bed with one hand and looked underneath. The thing that stared back at her had far too many teeth for polite company. She did not scream or faint. She simply met its gaze. It hesitated because monsters are, at heart, opportunists. They thrive on denial and half-belief. Being calmly acknowledged by a woman with chalk on her sleeves and iron in her eyes was not part of its usual script. "Out," Susan said. The word carried a weight that had nothing to do with her employer's authority and everything to do with blood ties she preferred not to discuss. The monster shuddered, came apart at the edges, and slunk back into the spaces between stories. The boy, who had expected either dismissal or hysteria, stared. "There," Susan said briskly. "No more monster. Unfortunately, that means you have no excuse not to finish your reading. If you have ever tried to live sensibly while the world insists on being strange, you may recognize her approach. Keep your spine straight, keep your voice calm, and treat the impossible as merely another item on the day's list." Susan had built her life on that method. She knew that death was her grandfather. She knew there was a pale horse somewhere in the stable of reality with her name written in its history. She had spent her childhood walking a tightrope between mortal schools and immortal duties. When she grew up, she chose the most ordinary profession she could find and held it in front of her like a shield. Governesses, in her experience, were respected, underpaid, and largely invisible. With firm boots and a sharper-than-average mind, she intended to be left alone to civilize other people's children and ignore the shadows at the edge of her vision. The universe, regrettably, had other plans. On the evening when it truly began, she sat in the nursery with a book of moral tales on her lap, and a small girl demanding one more story. Snow scratched at the window. "Tell us about the Hogfather," the girl said. Susan frowned. She did not like lying to children. She also did not like acknowledging beings who lived by the fuel of belief. They tended to take notice when you named them. "There is no Hogfather," she began, out of habit. "There is only—" She stopped. Something cut across her denial like a knife. For a moment the room tilted. The fire flickered, stretching shadows into unfamiliar shapes. She felt like a plucked string far away. The absence I had already tasted in the alleyways outside. Where the Hogfather should have been, there was hollowness. She knew how reality felt when something large had gone missing. She had walked in her grandfather's domain and seen the hourglasses that measured every life. When something tore there, she could feel the draft. She closed the book. "We will speak of the Hogfather later," she told the child. "For now, bed." Her voice was even, but some of the colour had drained from it. That night, when the household slept, Susan slipped out of her room and into a different sort of darkness. She stepped between the moments the way other people step between paving stones, and the nursery faded behind her. The world thinned, its ordinary edges peeling away to reveal the vast black spaces where her grandfather worked. The house of death loomed up, all angles and memory. The great clock ticked, measuring something older than time. The sound did nothing good for my headache. Somewhere at the edge of that relentless ticking I felt her arrive, and knew that whatever was wrong with Hogswatch had just obtained an investigator who would not be easily put off. She found Death's study empty, save for the traces of his presence, a faint smell of cold iron and old promises, A robe hung over the back of a chair, a scythe missing from its hooks. On the desk lay a list written in a precise hand, the names of children and the things they hoped to find by the fireside in the morning. Susan picked up the list. Her eyes moved down columns of dolls, wooden swords, picture books, toy carts. For each entry there hung, invisible to anyone else, a small, glowing thread of belief running back through the walls of reality to a bed, a pillow, a hopeful heart. The Hogfather should have been there, somewhere in the spaces between those threads. He was not. Instead, there was Death's empty robe, and a lingering sense of someone very tall and very determined having just left at speed. But we still wonder whether the people who try hardest not to believe in magic are the ones the world will call on first when the magic begins to fray. Long before I set eyes on him, I felt Death trying to be jolly. That may sound strange. Most people never feel death at all. They only notice the sudden absence of themselves. But gods, even small defective ones, have a different kind of nerve. We feel the pressure lines of belief and duty, the way sailors feel the pull of tides. That Hogswatch, the tides were in uproar. Someone had tugged the Hogfather out of his appointed place, and the world had panicked in its own quiet way. Children still wrote their hopeful little lists. Adults still said that such things were nonsense and still secretly hoped to be wrong. The shape of the ritual was intact. Its heart was missing. The universe dislikes mismatches. A function without a performer is like a bell without a clapper. In Death's dark house, far beyond the chimneys of Ankh-Morpork, a decision was made. Death stood in front of a mirror that did not reflect light so much as inevitability. He was a tall figure of blackness and bone, as ever. On the chair beside him lay red velvet, white fur, and a belt that looked as though it had been cut to restrain a small barrel. The garments radiated a sort of clumsy cheer, the distilled essence of every card, carving and sugar figure ever made in the Hogfather's image. He regarded the outfit. The outfit regarded him. Then, slowly, with the deliberate care of someone attempting a very delicate joke, Death put aside his robe and reached for the red coat. Albert hovered in the doorway, an old man wrapped in practicality and a greasy apron. He watched with horror that was only partly theological. On the one hand, he was seeing his master interfere in the business of gods, which was risky. On the other, he was seeing a skeleton try to fasten trousers designed for a stomach like a wine cask. "You cannot be serious," Albert muttered. Death fastened the belt. The coat hung loosely over his bony frame, but belief does strange work. To mortal eyes, he would be large and rounded, full of impossible dinners and unlimited generosity. The bones were only the scaffolding under the image. I did not know these details then. I have pieced them together from whispers and echoes, from the way people's memories bent around that night. Even a little god like me can read the imprint of a strong presence passing through the minds of thousands. Death took up a sack that contained more possibility than cloth and slung it over his shoulder. Albert fetched the fake beard with the air of someone passing a loaded crossbow to a child. Soon the cold, clean face of Death was buried behind a cascade of white. Only the blue glow in the sockets remained, twin lanterns behind the mask. In the courtyard, the sleigh waited. It had not been there a moment earlier. Now it was, heavy with tradition and expectation. The harness jingled without metal. 4 great beasts stamped in front of it, hooves striking sparks on nothing at all. They were not the mild reindeer of cards and songs. These were hogs, the size of small houses, bristling and tusked, each one a memory of older winters, when gifts had other shapes and blood on. The snow was part of the bargain. Death climbed aboard. There are rules of a kind about who may do what in the machinery of the world. They are old and mostly unwritten, enforced by the stubbornness of reality rather than by law. Gods preside over domains. Death collects what falls out of them. He does not, as a rule, stand in for absent deities. But this was not a night for rules. The sleigh rose, the sky thinned. Somewhere below, a very new god of hangovers swayed in an alley and tried not to be sick. Somewhere above, death, in the borrowed colours of joy, guided the hogs across a sky made of frost, starlight and fragile stories. The first stop was not a lonely cottage or a chimney. It was Crumley's, the grand department store where belief had already been turned into commerce. In the centre of its glittering toy floor stood a Hogfather's grotto, a painted cave piled with fake snow and real expectations. Parents by the dozen had queued with small, overexcited children to sit on a red-robed lap and whisper their wishes into a fake beard. That evening, the man hired to play the part had vanished under circumstances that will look perfectly innocent right up until the moment someone checks his contract. The staff muttered. The queue shifted. The Crumleys, sniffing impending disaster, prepared apologies. There is nothing quite so volatile as a crowd of children on the brink of disappointment. Then the lights flickered. A presence moved into the grotto, like winter itself stepping through a door. The air grew crisp, sharp, with the scent of pine and far-off stars. When the curtains parted, the Hogfather sat on the throne, not the sagging, slightly desperate figure of a man doing seasonal work, but something larger, more certain, older than Crumley's share price. His red coat hung perfectly. His beard, though false, was suddenly the most convincing thing in the room. Children approached one by one, propelled by parents whose assurances faltered as they neared. Under the froth of decorations, something in their animal minds recognized the shape of the figure before them. This was not safe. This was not cozy. This was myth, which had teeth and a long memory. "Ho, ho, ho," Death said. The words were careful, as if he had rehearsed them syllable by syllable. They hit the air with the weight of an oath. He listened to each child with grave attention, nodding as if every request were a matter of state. When a boy asked for a sword, Death inquired very precisely whether he meant a toy or a weapon, and then explained in detail why real steel in small hands was seldom a good idea. When a girl asked for her father to come home from the wars, he paused just a heartbeat too long before promising that all would be well if it could possibly be arranged. Unseen by the shoppers, reality tried to decide how to handle this. On the one hand, this was plainly an impersonation. On the other, the person doing the impersonating was Death, who is not good at pretending. He tends to be exactly what he is, wherever he stands. I have watched enough mortals stagger through mornings to know this much. When they talk about Hogswatch, they are not really talking about sausages or parcels. They are talking about the hope that, for one night, someone is keeping a ledger of kindness, that their small efforts and small decencies will not go unnoticed. In Crumley's that night, the ledger-keeper himself sat in the red chair and heard them all. Albert hovered at the edge of the grotto, pressing sugar pigs into the hands of stunned children, muttering warnings under his breath. Death ignored him cheerfully. He granted unreasonable presents with suspicious reasonableness, turned marketing exercises into acts of actual giving, and gently rearranged the priorities of an entire toy department. By the time he left, the staff were dazed, and the management were eyeing the day's takings with superstitious confusion. But we still wonder whether it matters who wears the red suit, or whether what truly counts is that someone, somewhere, keeps the promise that the dark will not be quite so dark tonight. High above the gas lamps and chimneys, the sleigh rose again. The hogs snorted steam, and time thinned into a long white road. Death urged them on toward poorer districts, where children left smaller offerings and asked less extravagantly, as if hope itself were something to be rationed. And down in the city's gutters I shivered and held my aching head, and felt, for the first time, the faintest warmth of something pushing back against the emptiness where the Hogfather should have been. Something tall and stubborn was standing in the gap, holding up a borrowed piece of sky while the bolts were loose. I did not yet know his name, though it was carved into the bones of the world. All I knew was that the night had not given up. If a god of hangovers ever learns anything, it is how to listen to what lies under the noise. The city was full of Hogswatch clatter that night. Bells, laughter, bad songs, the creak of overloaded carts. Under that, I began to hear another rhythm, like a slow drum. It was Death, doing his best to be merry. He did not stay long at Crumley's. Once the toy floor was unsettled enough to ask itself awkward questions, the sleigh rose and turned toward streets where the decorations were thinner and the snow more honest. There are always parts of a city where festival lights arrive last and leave first. Death had a list that did not care about neighborhoods. In the poorer quarter, where the river smell clung to walls and windows shone with a dull, stubborn glow, the Hogfather had never been entirely a joke. When you have little, the idea that someone might come in the night with something more than you expect is not folklore. It is survival in a red coat. Death stepped out of the sleigh into one such street. Frost glittered on the cobbles. In a narrow room behind a patched curtain, an old woman counted her coins for the third time and wished them into more. A little further on, a family squeezed around a table, passing the same bowl of stew back and forth, as if hunger could be shared along with the food. He followed the threads of belief like a fisherman following lines. Where a child had written a careful letter and hidden it under a mattress rather than risk mockery, he went in through a broken window and left the thing requested, not some cheaper cousin of it. Where a father had promised a feast and then lost his job, Death quietly adjusted the account. People woke to find a chicken where none had been, or an extra sack of coal, or a doll that had never seen the inside of a second-hand stall. A few swore they heard hooves on the slates. Most decided, in the grey honesty of morning, that some generous neighbour must have been responsible. That is the way humans protect their world from too much wonder. They sand the edges off miracles until they fit the shelves of probability. Not everyone saw only the softened version. Among the city's shabbier citizens there moved a group known as the Canting Crew, expert in the art of getting by on what the respectable world dropped. They had planned that Hogswatchnight to press their noses to the windows of the rich and then raid the bins. Instead, death brought the feast to them. On the hill, chandeliers shone on tables heavy with roasted birds and lacquered hams. Diners in fine clothes laughed and complained about the portions. A man dressed as the Hogfather moved among them, hired to add seasonal colour to a night already drowning in wine. Then something colder than winter stepped into the room. Later, those diners would recall only fragments. A sudden silence as the hired Hogfather stiffened. A chill, as if all the warmth had rushed to the corners of the ceiling. A voice, deep and precise, asking questions about charity that sounded unsettlingly like an audit. The man in the costume found himself gently but irresistibly replaced. When Death sat in the high-backed chair, the merry twinkle became something else entirely. He watched as dishes were carried in, piled high, destined for people who would complain if a sauce was not quite the right shade of brown. His blue gaze took in the waste, the casual indifference, the way the word festive had somehow been confused with the word entitled. He did not rage. That was not his way. He simply made an adjustment. By the time the diners raised their forks, the platters were empty. In the alley below the kitchen, the Canting Crew stared in wild disbelief at an avalanche of roast meat and puddings appearing on the cobbles in front of them, still hot and fragrant. They ate like people who have no idea when such abundance will come again. Back in the dining room, guests found their plates occupied by small, scruffy offerings rescued from the bins. A cracked bone, a heel of bread, a turnip that had seen better seasons. For a long, astonished moment, no one spoke. Then someone laughed, uncertainly, as if assuming this was a daring culinary joke. Death regarded them. "There are children who would consider this a feast," he observed. The words did not echo in the air. They echoed in the conscience, which is a much less comfortable space. He did not stay to tidy up their thoughts. He left that to the maitre d', who would later insist that some new Hogswatch tradition had been trialled and found wanting. The diners hurried home, eager to resume a version of the night where the food stayed where it was supposed to be. But somewhere under their ribs, a small, unwelcome awareness had been lodged, like a bone that refused to be swallowed and forgot to choke. Not far away, in a darker street, I felt the change like the easing of a knot. A little of the city's sharp resentment drained away, replaced by something almost like balance. For every full plate that became empty, an empty plate had become full. It was not justice. The scales are never that neat. But it was a gesture, and gestures have power. While Death redistributed roast goose and moral discomfort, Susan was engaged in a different kind of rearranging. She moved between her employer's nursery and her grandfather's halls, trying to hold two realities in the same steady gaze. In one, she corrected spelling, broke up quarrels, and negotiated truces over toys. In the other, she stood amid hourglasses and lists and tried to understand what it meant that Death had gone out in costume. She did not care for the idea that the universe needed a fat man in red to keep going. It offended every rational instinct she possessed. There should have been laws, forces, causes, and effects. Instead, there were stories, rituals, and a very literal grandfather attempting to embody both. She confronted him once in the space between journeys, when the sleigh hung poised above the world like a second bloodless moon. "Why the red?" she demanded. "Why the beard? Why any of this?" "Because," Death said, "you need the practice." The answer made no sense, and every kind of sense at once. Susan disliked it intensely. She also could not quite shake it. But we still wonder whether the rituals we dismiss as childish are in fact rehearsals for the faith we place in far grander inventions, like justice and mercy and the quiet belief that things can be better than they are. Down in the alleys, among the drunk and the desperate and the newly fed, I listened to the city breathe. The pain in my head told me there would be no shortage of work for me come morning. Beneath my own peculiar calling, something larger shifted. The night was being held together with red cloth, stubborn goodwill, and a skeletal hand on the reins. For the moment, it was enough. Morning in Ankh-Morpork is when the night tries to pretend it never happened. Streets are swept, shutters opened, and respectable people step carefully around evidence to the contrary. For me, unfortunately, the night never goes away. It just condenses in the skulls of my worshippers. I use the word worshippers loosely. No one builds temples to the "O God" of Hangovers. They build taverns instead, which are, frankly, more efficient. They do not pray to me in hymns. They mumble into chamber pots and mutter promises to any listening power that if the pain will only stop, they will never drink that much again. I feel those promises. They arrive as little spikes of agony, each one tuned exactly to the frequency of regret. That Hogswatch morning there were more of them than usual, as if the whole city had tried to drink its way through a gap in reality. My head rung like a bell that had taken up a new hobby in masonry. I had staggered as far as a small shrine, the sort people nail together out of leftover wood and fear. Someone had left an offering of cheap wine and a half-eaten sausage roll on the step. I eyed it with the professional interest of someone constitutionally incapable of helping themselves. Then the air changed. Imagine your worst hangover, the kind where light itself seems offensive, and then imagine someone opening a door right through the middle of your headache. Cold rushed in. Bells stopped. For one blessed second, the pain cut out entirely. I floated in a darkness that smelled of dust and inevitability. A hand seized my ear. It belonged to a young woman with hard grey eyes, and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to dragging uncooperative reality into line. She wore black with the sort of neatness that made me feel even more dishevelled than usual. "You," she said, "you should not exist." I had heard similar comments in the aftermath of particularly bad parties. Coming from her, it sounded less like an insult and more like a diagnosis. "I'm aware," I managed. "Believe me, no one is more surprised about this than I am." She studied me, head tipped slightly, as if listening for something only she could hear. "You are a god," she said slowly, "but not the usual kind." "Apparently," I croaked, "I am the O God of Hangovers." "You mean God of Hangovers," she corrected. "No," I said, "I heard it quite distinctly. People say, 'Oh God,' a lot." Her mouth twitched, just once. "My name is Susan," she said. "I have questions. I never stood a chance." She took me by the arm with the firm grip of a woman used to hauling recalcitrant pupils away from mischief, and the darkness closed in again. When it cleared, we were standing in the great hall of unseen university. The place hummed with the kind of magic that makes the air feel heavy and the floor feel slightly unsure of itself. Wizards in pointy hats peered over balconies and around doorframes, drawn by the possibility of drama and a free biscuit. At the centre of the hall, on a table that had once served nobler purposes, sat a contraption of wood, glass, and antlers. Candles flickered under carefully arranged pipes. Gears ticked. Mouse tails hung from a tiny clothesline. It looked like the result of giving abstract mathematics to a child and then leaving the room too long. This was Hex, the thinking engine. It thought about thormic turbulence, stochastic probability, the price of dried frogs in wholesale quantities, and anything else. Ponder Stibbons, the young wizard in charge of it, could persuade the faculty to fund. Ponder hurried toward us, clutching a sheaf of notes and a pen that looked as if it had given up on sleep. Hex has been behaving oddly, he told Susan, not bothering to hide his excitement. There are fluctuations in the belief field, little spikes, lots of them. He peered at me with academic interest, which is only slightly less unnerving than outright hostility. "And you are one of the products," he murmured. "Products," I repeated faintly. "Emergent anthropomorphic personification of a narrow human concept," he translated. "Fragmentary God, very narrow remit, probably unstable. You make it sound so glamorous," I said. Susan ignored us both. She had that distant look again, the one that meant she was listening to deeper currents. "You said little spikes," she prompted. "Bits of belief looking for somewhere to stick. Show us." Ponder adjusted some levers on Hex. The candles flickered. The ants inside their little glass tubes hurried along new paths. An icon labelled Request with Clatchian coffee appeared in glowing letters, then vanished when he scowled at it. The hall blurred. For a moment I saw the city from above, its rooftops dusted with frost, its chimneys smoking like tired lungs. Tiny points of light flickered everywhere, some bright and steady, some thin and wavering. Most people were believing the usual things, in their families, in the value of money, in the probability that tomorrow would look roughly like today, only with slightly fewer leftovers. Some believed in the Hogfather, though that belief was currently being kept alive by one very determined skeleton in a red suit. But scattered through the mass were those strange spikes, quick and sharp. A woman cursed the pimple on her nose, certain that something vindictive was responsible. A man glared at his receding hairline and blamed the universe personally. Someone swore that there must be a sock eater somewhere because there was no other explanation. Belief is creative. It hates a blank. Normally a large, solid myth like the Hogfather anchors a lot of that vague, imaginative energy. Take him away, and people begin throwing their spare conviction at anything that looks like it might stick. Out at the edges of human thought, new shapes flickered into being. A spindly figure with a bag of stolen socks and a guilty expression. A hunched creature muttering about acne. Sleek little wasp things that lived in the folds of towels and took great delight in ensuring they were always just out of reach when you stepped from the bath. They were ridiculous. They were also real in the only sense that matters for such entities, which is that humans had started to mutter their names with sufficient conviction. Hex translated the chaos into numbers. Ponder translated the numbers into worry. The spare belief has to go somewhere, he said. If a major anthropomorphic personification is missing, the field compensates. We are seeing spontaneous formation of minor gods. Very minor, almost homeopathically diluted. He frowned at me. Except you, he added. You are uncomfortably substantial. Thank you, I said. I do my best. Susan paced in front of Hex, boots clicking on the old stones. So the Hogfather is missing, she said. Death is impersonating him to keep the story alive. Belief is splintering into a cloud of tiny deities, each feeding on some petty human obsession. And this, she jerked her head in my direction, is what happens when you concentrate too many hangovers in one place. Her summary was unfair but depressingly accurate. Do we know why the Hogfather is gone? Ponder ventured. Someone has found a way to attack him through the roots of belief, Susan replied. Through children, through the stories they tell themselves when their teeth fall out and they are afraid of the dark. Her voice had a new edge when she mentioned children. A governess is a very specific kind of warrior. She fights daily against ignorance, boredom, and the chaos of growing minds. Threaten her pupils in a larger, more metaphysical way, and you touch something fierce. Hex clicked and creaked. A tiny wooden arm wrote on a slate. Ponder leaned in to read it. Query. Destination of concentrated dental narratives, he read aloud. Cross-reference, Tooth Fairy. The words hung in the air like a signpost in a blizzard. Tooth Fairy, the little transaction under the pillow. A coin for a tooth, a bargain between a child and the vast, indifferent world. A promise that loss could be exchanged for something bright and shiny. If you want to undermine belief from the ground up, you start where people first learn to trust stories, with their own bodies. Susan straightened. I will need to see where the teeth go, she said. Ponder blanched. Wizards are brave in the face of many things, but few of them enjoy travel into the soft, uncharted territories of childhood imagination. I suppose I shall come too, I heard myself say. They both looked at me, surprised. The notion that a hangover god might volunteer for anything beyond a glass of water was clearly a new one. The more of us who understand what is happening, the better, I added. And besides, wherever we are going, there will certainly be people who regret last night. It was not courage, exactly. It was simply that I had begun to suspect something. If I existed only because the world was wobbling, perhaps I owed it the courtesy of trying to stand steady for a while. But we still wonder whether the smallest and silliest of our fears and comforts are truly trivial, or whether they are the loose threads that, once tugged, can unravel the whole pattern of what we believe. Leaving unseen university is like sobering up between one step and the next. One moment you are under chandeliers, held up more by habit than masonry, surrounded by men whose hats are taller than their common sense. The next, you are outside in thin winter daylight, where the rules are supposed to be clearer. They were not clearer that morning. Snow had turned to the kind of slush that creeps into boots and ruins. Optimism. Susan walked ahead with her long, determined stride, as if the world were a corridor, and she meant to reach the far door before it closed. I followed, my head full of equations I did not understand, and gods I had never asked to meet. Behind us, the wizards fretted over hex and muttered about thresholds and narrative stress points. In front of us, the city carried on believing. Children lost teeth. Coins slid under pillows. Somewhere between those two facts lay a doorway, and Susan intended to find it. "You are certain you want to come?" she asked without turning. "Absolutely," I said. "I was created by the collective misery of the recently festive. How much worse can it get?" She gave the faintest snort. "That is as close to encouragement as some people ever provide. The house we sought was ordinary, which in this context made it suspicious. It stood on a quiet street where nothing much ever happened, the sort of place reality uses to stack its unremarkable days. Its front windows reflected more blank sky than anything else. "It leaks," Susan said. "Places like this always do. Old stories seep through." Instead of the front entrance, she led us to a side door half buried in snow. The lock should have been stiff. It opened as easily as a secret told to the right listener. Inside, the air had the dry, waiting feel of a room between tenants. Hallway, staircase, a table with a bowl on it. No dust, no clutter, nothing to anchor the eye. "Teeth do not stay here," Susan murmured. "They pass through. The real place will be further in." She took a small object from her pocket and held it up. It was a child's tooth, white and ordinary in the way only something irreplaceable can be. When children imagine the tooth fairy, she said, this is what they are really giving away, a piece of their belief in how the world should work. Loss exchanged for reward. Fear traded for reassurance. The teeth are receipts. She dropped the tooth into the empty bowl. Reality shivered. The hallway elongated, the way a reflection stretches in a warped mirror. Doors slid along the walls like beads on a string. The ordinary light peeled away, and something too bright and soft took its place. For a dizzy moment, I felt as if we were falling sideways. Then we were not in the house anymore. The tooth fairy's domain was white. Not the white of snow, but the flat whiteness of a page that has decided it will become a picture, and has not yet chosen which one. We stood in a landscape of toy cupboards and nursery furniture stretching into mist. Wardrobes with slightly open doors. Beds with lace canopies. Rows of little chairs no one was sitting on. Everything had the over-clean look of a room prepared by someone who has never met an actual child. In the middle of it all, rising like an improbable palace, was the castle. It was built from blocks and stacked picture books, from drawers and toy chests and piles of alphabet cubes. Each brick was a story. Each story was one more repetition of the bargain. Give up a tooth, gain a coin, and a promise that the world notices when small parts of you fall away. We walked toward it. The ground felt firm and unreal, like walking on the memory of a floor. Then I became aware of the teeth. They were everywhere. Not in ugly heaps, nothing so crude. They were sorted into little chests and boxes labelled in a script that was never meant for human eyes. Lines of ivory gleamed behind glass. Drawers slid shut as we passed, as if embarrassed at being seen. Each tooth was a drop of concentrated belief, pulled from under pillows and placed here for safekeeping. "Every one of these," Susan said quietly, "belongs to a story." I could feel them, humming faintly like a hive full of lost moments. First lost tooth, first realization that the body can change without permission. First lesson that something taken might be returned as something else, if you trust the right invisible stranger. If someone controlled them, I said, they could tell the stories what to do. Susan nodded. Imagine whispering into that many childhoods at once. Imagine telling them there is no Hogfather, that no one is coming, that the dark is only dark and will never end. The thought made my headache suddenly feel very small. We climbed the steps to the castle, which were made of stacked toy boxes. The doors at the top were painted with smiling moons and stars. Up close, the smiles were a fraction too wide. Inside, the corridors twisted in ways that would delight a certain kind of child and horrify their parents. Doors led to other doors. Cupboards opened onto staircases. At every turn there were hints of familiar tales. A slipper, a spindle, a wolf's shadow stretched thin along a wall of white. All the flotsam of bedtime stories had washed up here and learned to stand upright. Here magic was not the solemn element wizards shuffled in their laboratories. It was the raw, sticky stuff of imagination, smeared on walls and pushed under pillows by small, determined hands. It was powerful precisely because no one over 4 feet tall really believed in it. Only here, the engine behind it had not simply gone. It had been taken. In a high central chamber we found the hoard. Shelves of teeth rose around us, reaching up into the shadows. Each little box a spark waiting to be turned. Threads of possibility ran between them like a web, spun out of milk and moonlight. Somewhere above, where the light looked strained, Jonathan Teatime was already at work, hands on the levers of the nursery world. But we still wonder whether the places we dismiss as make-believe are exactly where the deepest switches of our lives are hidden, waiting for any hand ruthless enough to reach in and flip them. If you grow out of monsters under the bed, you might think you have grown out of the people who use them. But Jonathan Teatime was proof that some children simply move their nightmares outward and learn to live inside them. I sensed him before I saw him, the way a tooth senses the dentist. In the castle, at the heart of the Tooth Fairy's domain, the air was already tense from all that bottled belief. Somewhere above, a sharper intention cut through that murmur like a razor through paper. We climbed. The stairs here were made of stacked storybooks and wooden blocks. Susan went first, jaw set, one hand on the hilt of the poker she carried everywhere now. It was a fireplace tool, yet it looked at home in her grip, as if steel recognized someone prepared to use it. At the landing, the whiteness opened into a long hall. Toys lined the walls in rows, dolls with fixed smiles, tin soldiers in perfect formation, wooden horses that would never scuff their paint, all gleaming and untouched. Teatime stood at the far end, framed by a high window that looked out onto nothing at all. He was slight, almost delicate, in a neat black suit that would have been handsome if not for the way he wore it, as if it were a costume. One eye was bright and focused. The other seemed to be watching something only he could see. He smiled when he saw us. "I hoped someone interesting would come," he said. "It would be so dull if no one noticed." Susan did not bother with pleasantries. "You have taken the teeth," she said. "You are using them to tamper with the Hogfather." "Such an ugly verb, tamper," Teatime replied. "I prefer refine. Children believe all sorts of things. I am only teaching them to stop believing one of them." He gestured, and for the first time I saw the machinery he had made of the hoard. Threads of pale light ran from towering racks of teeth to a spinning lattice in the centre of the hall, a mobile built by someone who had read a description of planets and decided they could be improved. Each tooth fed a thin beam into the structure. As it turned, pulses travelled along invisible paths into the distant bedrooms of the city. The children did not hear words in their sleep. They felt doubt. The kindly, impossible figure in red thinned at the edges. Presence seemed less like magic and more like obligation. A whisper brushed their dreaming minds with the suggestion that no one was watching, that the world was an empty ceiling, not a sky. "I am only making the universe a more reasonable place," Tea Time said. "One little belief at a time." Susan stepped closer, boots clicking on the white floor. "You think you can remove one story and leave everything else intact," she said. "You do not understand how humans work." "On the contrary," Tea Time replied, "I understand perfectly. Take away the Hogfather and they will still go on. The world will keep turning, but it will be cleaner. No more lies." "They are not lies," Susan said. "They are practice." The word hung in the air between them. Even I, with my head full of other people's mistakes, felt something tighten around it. Tea Time laughed softly. "Spare me. Children believe because they are told to. I am simply telling them something else. There is no Hogfather. No one is coming through the sky. Only parents with tight budgets and sore backs. It is kinder, really." Somewhere beneath our feet, a faint crack ran through the foundations of the place. Castles built of stories do not like being mocked from the inside. I took a step sideways, which is the closest a god of hangovers comes to bravery. The nearer I stood to his machinery, the louder it sounded in my head. That thin, insistent hum of doubt seeping into dreams. As someone who spends his existence dealing with regret, I recognized the flavor of it. If Tea Time finished his work, regret would start earlier. Children would learn it with their first lost tooth. "You must stop this," I said. He glanced at me as one might glance at an unpleasant smell. "And what are you?" he asked. "Another minor superstition, a leftover from someone's bad decision. You will vanish when the field stabilizes." He was not entirely wrong. My existence depended on a certain level of human folly. Take away the festivals, the excess, the desperate morning promises, and I would fade like steam. But what he did not see was that the same mechanism sustained him. Without stories, there are no assassins in black suits with theatrical manners, no guilds with velvet committees and prices for divine heads. There is only a knife and a body, and a silence that does not care. Susan saw it. "You are a child who decided never to grow up," she said quietly. "You still think the world is a game you can win by changing the rules, but grown-ups live inside the promises they make. That is what belief is for." For a heartbeat, something flickered in Tea Time's eyes. A shadow of a boy left alone too long in a room full of sharp objects. Then the smile snapped back into place. But we still wonder whether those who tear down comforting stories are braver than those who keep them, or merely more afraid of what might be required if they admitted they needed them too. Perhaps you know that feeling. One winter you announce that you are done with all this nonsense, that you will not hang lights or wrap gifts or pretend to be surprised. It feels stern. Yet somewhere inside, a quieter voice might ask what you plan to put in place of the shared foolishness you have just dismantled. Susan lifted the poker. Around us, the shelves of teeth trembled. The castle seemed to lean in to listen. Belief and disbelief faced one another across a white floor built entirely out of old stories. Above, far away in a red coat, death kept driving the sleigh on. Below, in warm beds, children turned uneasily in their sleep as their dreams were tugged between presence and emptiness. And in the middle, in the chamber of the Tooth Fairy, one governess, one assassin, and one bewildered god of hangovers took their places on the small stage where a world's midwinter might yet keep its shape. I had seen tea time's kind of madness before, in smaller doses. There is a certain look some people get when they decide the world is only a puzzle and everyone else is a piece. What I had not seen until that moment was how such a person looks beside someone who still believes, quite seriously, that stories should come out all right in the end. The door at the far end of the hall opened with unnecessary politeness. It was the sort of door you might find in a rich house, polished and heavy. It did not belong in a castle made out of toy chests and bedtime promises. Neither, in a way, did the man who came through it. He filled the doorway. Broad shoulders strained his cheap jacket. His hands were like spades, scarred and uncertain of where to rest. His hair had been slicked down with something that glistened and failed. He wore his own muscles the way a child wears an oversized coat, as if someone had dropped strength onto him without the instruction manual. "Banjo," Tea Time said lightly. "Come in. We have guests." Banjo stepped forward, his boots surprisingly careful on the white floor. His eyes, small and anxious in that wide face, flicked from Tea Time to Susan to me and back again. "Mr. T.R. Timé," he managed. The name never sat quite right in his mouth. "Ma'am said I wasn't to hit ladies." "Quite right," Tea Time said, smiling. "We are not at the hitting part yet." Banjo relaxed by a fraction, which in his case was still more tension than most people manage in a lifetime. He stood there, an enormous question in human form, waiting for his next instruction. I could feel the story adjusting itself around him. Every fairy tale castle needs a giant at the gate. Banjo was not a giant in the tall, elegant sense. He was the sort you might find in an old picture book, placed there to be frightened of until you noticed the sadness in the eyes. Susan saw it at once. Of course she did. Governesses are experts in reading frightened strength. "Hello, Banjo," she said, in much the same tone she might have used for a nervous boy with jam on his cuffs. "You have been helping Mr. Tea Time, have you?" Banjo shifted his weight, casting a quick glance at his employer. "Mister's in charge," he said. "We come through the teeth place. Mister says I'm to do what he says." "And does Mister say why?" Susan asked. Banjo looked as if she had presented him with an essay question. "He says," Banjo began slowly, "that there's to be no more Hogswatch nonsense. That's for kiddies, he says. Ma'am said I was to do what the man from the guild tells me, because they pays proper." The words did not fit. Him. They hung off his tongue like borrowed clothes. Somewhere in the muddle there was a dutiful son trying to follow instructions that did not match his shape. Tea Time watched this with amusement, as a child might watch a clockwork toy bump into furniture. "Banjo is very useful," he said. "People see his size and think they know what he is. It seldom occurs to them that he could be set to other purposes. The nasty brilliance of it was that he was right. The world is not kind to the obviously strong and inwardly unsure. It offers them blunt jobs and blunt roles, and rarely asks what else they might be capable of. I thought of taverns where big men moved chairs and broke up fights for coin, never asked to read the notices on the door. I thought of how easy it is to treat such people as furniture that occasionally lifts other furniture. Tea Time had done something worse. He had given Banjo a place in a story without explaining that it was the villain's story. Susan took a few steps closer, ignoring Tea Time's sharpening gaze. "Banjo," she said, "do you know what this place is?" Banjo squinted at the white walls, the piles of boxes, the endless shelves of teeth. "It's where the tooth lady works," he said. "Mister says it's all just made up, but he wanted the teeth, said they was useful." "Do you like it here?" Susan asked. There was a strange pause. It was not a question Banjo had expected. "It's quiet," he said at last. "No shouting, no boys throwing stones. Mister says I'm to keep watch. I'm good at watching, Mam says." "You are," Susan agreed, "and you know what else you are. You are the biggest child in this whole place." He looked confused. Adults had been trying for years to push him over some invisible line called grown-up. No one had ever suggested his lingering childishness might be an asset. "This castle," Susan went on, "is built out of children's stories, out of their teeth and their fear and their hope. Mr. Tea Time is trying to spoil those stories. He is using the teeth to tell children that no one is coming for them. Does that sound right to you?" Banjo stared at the racks around us, at the neat little boxes that hummed faintly with sleeping belief. I could see the effort it cost him to imagine all the small faces behind those teeth. Banjo was slow with words, but he knew about fear. He had grown up in its long shadow. "Mam said," he murmured, "Mam said you don't frighten kiddies for fun. That's wicked." Tea Time's smile tightened. "Banjo," he said sharply, "do not listen to the governess. She is trying to confuse you. You work for me. You remember what we came for." "I remember," Banjo said, but there was doubt now. It moved in his voice like a third person. If you have ever watched someone realize that they have been used badly by someone cleverer than they are, you know that moment hurts in a special way. It is not just the betrayal. It is the shame of having handed over your strength for the wrong purpose. You see it in people leaving bad jobs, bad friendships, bad loves. They look at their own hands as if wondering how they could not have known. Susan stepped carefully into that crack. "Someone should be in charge here," she said. "Someone who understands that the teeth belong to children. Someone who knows what it is to be frightened and would never use that against them. Someone who can watch and keep others out." She reached into the impossible folds of her black dress and drew out something that glinted softly, a little golden crown, the sort you might find on top of a very indulgent cake. It was ridiculous. It was also exactly right. This was a castle of old nursery tales. Power here did not look like a guild contract. It looked like a shiny thing placed solemnly on a head and taken very seriously. Susan held the crown up to Banjo. "You could be that someone," she said. "You could be the one who says who comes in and who does not. You could be the big man at the gate who keeps the bad monsters out instead of helping them in." Banjo's mouth fell open. No one had ever suggested he might be the gate, not just the fist. "Mister won't like it," he whispered. Tea Time took a step forward, eyes glittering. "Banjo," he said, almost gently, "I am the one who tells you what your mother would want. Put that down. There is a good lad. You do not want to make me cross. There are many kinds of fear. Some are loud and obvious. Others creep in wearing concern." Banjo had lived under both. For a moment his shoulders sagged under the weight of years of being told he was too big, too slow, too much. Then he looked at Susan. She met his gaze with the unflinching steadiness of someone who has seen the worst a child can endure and refuses to add to it. "Mam said," he repeated slowly, "Mam said I wasn't to hit anyone who couldn't hit back. And kiddies can't hit back. Not proper. Mister, you've been shouting in their heads, haven't you?" Tea Time's expression twisted, just a fraction. The careful charm slipped enough for the cruelty beneath to show through. "Banjo," he said, and there was an edge in it now. Banjo took the crown from Susan's hand. It looked absurdly tiny as he set it, very gently, on his own head. Something in the castle shifted. The walls straightened. The shelves of teeth hummed in a new key. The story had been offered a new shape, and it was considering it. "I think," Banjo said slowly, "I think I'm to watch the door now, mister." But we still wonder whether the gentlest people, the ones the world writes off as slow or simple, might be the only ones strong enough to stand in certain doorways and say no more. If you have ever seen a quiet colleague finally refuse an unfair request, or a shy friend step between someone small and someone cruel, you know that feeling. It is not dramatic. It is not tidy. It is simply a weight moving to the right side of the scale at last. In the high hall of the Tooth Fairy's castle, that weight shifted. Banjo, the big child, straightened his back. Tea Time's smile became thinner and more dangerous. Susan tightened her grip on the poker. And I, the god of hangovers, felt something new in the air. Not doubt, not pain, but the first faint, steadying throb of a different kind of belief. Not in a fat man in red or a tinkling fairy, but in the idea that even those who are used as tools can choose one day to be guardians instead. Stories are like snow. They fall one flake at a time, light and forgettable, until one morning you wake to find the world quietly buried. The castle at the centre of the Tooth Fairy's realm had grown like that. Drift upon drift of small white teeth, each dropped under a pillow by a child who decided to trust that somebody kind would notice. When Banjo set the foolish paper crown on his head, that long snowfall shifted. The light in the high hall steadied. The thin, anxious hum in the walls faded. Somewhere deep inside, the masonry of stories, gears made of old hopes began, very slowly, to turn toward him instead of toward Jonathan Tea Time. Tea Time felt it at once. People like him always sense when the stage tilts away from them. "Banjo," he said, voice bright and sharp, "take that off. You are here to help me." Banjo's hand rose halfway, then dropped. His brow folded with the visible effort of thinking. "Mam said I was to look after little uns," he muttered. "There's a lot of little uns' teeth here, mister. That means they're watching." Along the shelves there was a faint chiming, as if thousands of milk teeth had just clicked together in approval. For a heartbeat, Tea Time's smile cracked. showing the bare resentment underneath. Then he stepped sideways into the deeper corridors, letting the castle open a path upward for him. "He is going to the top," Susan said, "where the main switch must be." She turned to Banjo. "Hold the gate. No one comes in unless you say so. These teeth belong to children." Banjo straightened, with the crown on his head and the ear. Castle listening, his size stopped being an accident and became a purpose. "Yes, miss," he said. "We left him there, a newly appointed guardian on the edge of childhood, and followed tea-time's route." The white passages we entered were not blank. Up close they were layered like old wallpaper. Here a strip with yellow ducks. There a band of marching elephants. Snatches of nursery rhyme text. Bits of handwriting. A drawing pinned forever at knee-height. The floorboards remembered small feet and long nights. The air smelt faintly of talc and tears. It is a queasy thing, walking through other people's first fears. The corridors were lined with giants that had once been furniture. Wardrobes, rockers, high chairs with dark spaces under them. To an adult eye they would have been clutter. To me, who hears the echo behind regret, they were fossils of terror and comfort pressed together. The castle tested Susan as we climbed. Shadows under beds stretched a little too far as she passed. Cracks between boards whispered that they were deeper than they looked. A single doll sat on a chair at the end of one corridor, its painted smile fixed just a shade too wide, as if waiting to be caught moving. Then, at a bend, a new door appeared. It opened onto a small bedroom that made my head ache for reasons that had nothing to do with hangovers. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt. A shelf of adventure books. A desk with a scrubbed but stubborn ink stain. A stocking heavy with obviously hand-wrapped gifts hanging from the bedpost. There were no hourglasses here, no scythes in the corners, no echo of a house at the end of time. This was the sort of room a girl might have had if she belonged entirely to the ordinary world and had never had to step sideways out of it. For a moment Susan stood in the doorway, shoulders very still, as if listening to a life she might have lived. "I see," she said at last. She closed the door, firmly but without anger. "Not mine. We keep going." The pressure in the air dipped, like a storm changing its mind. The castle had offered her a softer story. Once upon a time, you were normal. She had refused it. There are doors that change you simply by walking through them. She chose to stay changed. If you have ever looked back at an easier life, you could have taken and gone on without it. You know that weight. Somewhere in your head there is always a neat little room where that life waits, tidy and unused. The danger is not in remembering it. The danger is to move back in out of spite at the life you did choose. The stairs grew steeper. The steps changed from painted blocks to neat rows of tooth boxes, then to something that looked like sentences turned to stone. The air sharpened to a high, bright cold. We were climbing through layers of belief, leaving the soft-edged nursery tales below and moving toward the bare bones they had been laid over. In one narrow stretch, mobiles dangled above us, turning slowly. At first, they seemed charming. Carved pigs, tiny boots, twirling stars. Then I saw the pigs' tusks, too long and too old. The sticky shine on the boots. The stars with edges like small knives. Older bits, Susan said. Before there was a jolly Hogfather, there were midwinter sacrifices. Before coins under pillows, there were teeth on altars. Stories repaint, but they rarely erase. At last, the passage opened into a circular chamber near the top of the castle. Here, the whiteness hardened into glassy plains. Teeth were set into the walls in delicate spirals, each glinting like a tiny, solidified flinch of courage. Threads of light ran between them, all converging on the structure hanging in the middle of the room. It was a crown made of bone and light, slowly turning. The racks below fed it with a constant trickle of belief. With every slow rotation, pulses ran outward along invisible tracks into bedrooms all over the city, brushing the dreams of every child who had ever woken with their tongue in the new gap in their smile. This was the main switch Susan had named, humming with the traffic of lost teeth and small hopes. Tea-Time waited beside it, one hand resting possessively on the frame. "You see," he said, bright with triumph, "the plumbing of faith, the first little story about loss and reward. I am almost done. Soon, when a child reaches under the pillow, there will be no coin, no sense that anyone noticed. They will learn early there is nobody out there, much more honest. And when they grow," Susan asked, "what will they believe in instead of the Hogfather and the Tooth Fairy?" "Nothing," Tea-Time said. "That is the point. No more sentimental lies. But we still wonder whether empty spaces in the heart really stay empty, or whether something colder and louder always hurries to live there when gentler stories are stripped away. I could feel the castle straining around us. It had not been built for nothingness. It was a fragile machine for turning small fears into small comforts, for teaching that when a piece of you is lost, the universe might notice and answer with a coin. Pull that belief out, and the structure will not stand politely vacant. Another story will move in, one that savors fear more than hope." "You cannot stop people believing," I said. "You can only push them toward different beliefs." Tea-Time's eye glittered. "Exactly," he said. "Tonight we see what they cling to when you kick their first crutch away." The crown of teeth flared. The threads thrummed. Somewhere high above, hooves struck sparks from winter air as death drove the hogs harder through the dark. Somewhere far below, Banjo stood at his post, doing his best to be the kind of guard his mother would have trusted. The castle of stories held its breath while the man who despised stories set his hand more firmly on the lever. Some fights look wrong even before they begin. Swords and pistols belong in dueling grounds and back alleys. They do not look quite themselves in a room built out of milk teeth and bedtime bargains. Yet there we were, in the crown chamber of the Tooth Fairy's castle, watching Jonathan Tea-Time reach for the handle that told sleeping children what the world was like. Susan moved first. She lunged toward the bone crown, poker raised. Tea-Time's hand flicked, and the threads of light shuddered. For a moment, the room tilted, as if we all stood on the edge of a dream turning into a nightmare. You learn to recognize that change if you spend enough time around regret. Ordinary bad dreams sweat themselves out by morning. The other kind leave something behind, a hard little knot of certainty. I felt those knots forming in 1,000 small chests as Tea-Time's alterations rippled outward. Susan slammed the poker into the base of the spinning crown. Sparks of belief flew like startled fireflies. Several threads snapped sending a spray of unassigned conviction into the walls. The castle flinched. Down below, Banjo's crown glowed for a heartbeat as stray faith sought a gentler anchor. Tea Time did not shout. He only smiled wider and reached behind his back. Until that moment, I had thought Death's sword had stayed safely in its own dark scabbard. I had not accounted for Tea Time's talent for getting into places knives were not meant to go. He drew it with a little flourish, as though he were producing a trick from his sleeve. The blade did not shine so much as insist. It caught the pale light and turned it into something sharper than sight. The air around it thinned, even the threads of belief seemed to edge away. "Let us be proper about this," Tea Time said. "It would be a shame to ruin such a tidy experiment at the last moment." He swung. Susan leapt aside. The sword bit into the floor where she had been, carving a neat absence. Part of the white stone simply stopped existing. Fragments drifted up like startled dust, and then were not there at all. Death's sword does not cut things. It deletes them. You might think this would give him an unbeatable advantage. In most places, perhaps it would. But this was not a normal room. It was a knot of children's fears, wrapped in ribbon. Here the rules were different. The sword did not quite know where to land. Every edge was also an idea. Susan understood that quicker than I did. She kept moving, forcing Tea Time to swing at furniture that existed only because it had been believed in very hard. Each time the sword struck, the castle shrieked along invisible nerves. A wardrobe vanished. A chair ceased to have ever been sat on. But the structure held. "You cannot win," Tea Time called. "This realm runs on stories, and I have the sharpest ending." Susan said nothing. Talking wastes breath. Instead, she changed direction and drove the poker into one of the supports holding the crown mechanism aloft. It buckled. Threads snapped in earnest now, whipping around the chamber like furious cobwebs. In that crackling storm, I slipped toward the far wall, drawn by a tug I could not ignore. There was another door there, small and plain, almost shy among the show of teeth. It did not look important. Important doors rarely do. I opened it. The room beyond was low and dim. No whiteness, no toys. Just a narrow bed, a table, a chair. On the bed lay someone small, wrapped in blankets that did not look as if anyone had tucked them in. The air smelt of chalk dust, old wool, and something older still. The sour tang of fear that has been turned inward until it dries. She looked like a tired old woman at first glance. Lines scored her face at odd angles, as if they had been cut by small, repeated flinches. Her eyes opened as I stepped in. They were not human eyes. They were the colour of the underside of beds. "You have come then," she whispered, "at last." Susan appeared beside me, breath quick from dodging a sword in a room that did not approve of swords. She took in the scene with one sweep of her gaze. "You are the Tooth Fairy," she said. The figure on the bed gave a small, dry laugh. "I was the thing under the bed once," she said. The shadow in the wardrobe. The shape at the end of the corridor. Children gave me names and trembled. I grew strong on it. Her voice rasped, but there was an odd pride in it, as someone might speak of an unbeautiful youth that had nonetheless been entirely their own. "And then they grew," she went on, "and their fear turned to other things. Taxes, wars, love. They forgot the underbed. I tried to cling on, But there is nothing so helpless as a bogey who has lost his proper size. Susan listened, hand still tense on the poker. "So you changed," she said. "I learned to walk softer," the creature said. They began to put their teeth under the pillows, small tokens of a first loss. I took them, yes, but I left coins. A bargain. A little story of my own. No longer the thing that waited to devour them, the one who proved someone was watching while they slept. Her hand twitched toward the wall, as if she could feel the countless boxes beyond it. "And then they came," she whispered. "The ones who like things neat. They made me swallow the others, all the bogies. Too many teeth, too many fears. I could not hold them. I am coming apart. And he—" Her gaze flicked toward the chamber outside, where Tea-Time laughed as the castle shook around his sword. "He is using my hoard," she said, "telling the little ones there is no bargain, no watching, only emptiness. I had always thought of the Tooth Fairy as a small tinkling thing, all glitter and wings. Seeing her like this, an old bogeyman who had dragged herself through the narrow gate of kindness and found work on the other side, unsettled me more than any shadow under any bed. There is a particular bravery in choosing to be better than your origin. It is tiring. No one writes songs about it. Yet, without such choices, the world would be entirely at the mercy of first drafts." "Can you stop him?" Susan asked. The old creature shook her head. "Teeth are simple," she said. "Stories are not. Someone must mind them when I am gone." "Banjo," Susan said. The Tooth Fairy closed her eyes for a moment, tasting the name. "The big child?" she murmured. "Yes, he knows fear. He would not waste it for fun." Her fingers relaxed. Teeth somewhere deep in the castle chimed like distant sleigh bells. With a tiny sigh, the first bogey and last Tooth Fairy let go of the story she had been holding together for so long. There was no dramatic flash, no shriek, only a quiet, definite absence, as if she had finally moved out from under every bed. We stepped back into the crown chamber. The chaos had grown. Tea-Time and Susan circled each other on a floor increasingly missing important pieces. The crown of teeth swung wildly, threads whipping like comet tails. Images formed and dissolved in the air. A child opening an empty box. A stocking with nothing in it. A sky with no sleigh. "You are too late," Tea-Time called. "Soon they will wake and find nothing. They will learn the truth. No more Hogfather, no more fairy, no more lies." Susan's eyes were very dark. "They will learn there is nothing in the dark," she said, "and that no one is coming. And then they will have to decide what they will be to one another. That is too much truth to give a child." She moved as she spoke, picking her way along the remaining patches of floor toward the spinning crown. Tea-Time lunged after her, sword slicing bright absences through the air. At the edge, overlooking the dizzy drop into the misty interior of the castle, she stopped. Tea-Time stepped close, blade raised. For a heartbeat, the world balanced on that point. Then, the castle chose. The remaining planks under Tea-Time's feet shifted. Not much. Just enough. You could almost imagine a giggle in the wood, the kind children use when the bully finally trips over the smallest step in the yard. Susan stepped back. Tea-Time, eyes widening, tried to compensate. The sword carved a perfect line through the crown's support, severing the last tie between the mechanism and his control. And then he fell. He did not plummet cleanly. Stories dislike waste. Platforms appeared for him to hit on the way down, each one packed with relics of childhood. Toy soldiers, rocking horses, grinning puppets. He crashed through them, a small, black-clad shape battered by everything he had tried to treat as pieces on his board. He vanished at last into the white below, toward the point where this realm emptied back into the harder angles of the world. I did not envy what waited for him there. A man who cannot tell the difference between games and lives rarely meets a gentle ending. The crown of teeth, freed from his grip, slowed. The wild threads settled into new paths. Some ran outward again toward small heads on pillows, carrying not the certainty that no one cared, but the quieter belief that even in loss there might be a coin, a bargain, a watching presence. Others ran downward, toward Banjo and his ridiculous crown, giving weight to his new authority. But we still wonder whether the monsters we recast as guardians remain monsters in some hidden bone, or whether every frightened shape deserves at least one chance to stand on the side of the bed and promise there is nothing there. I cannot answer that for all bogies and men. I only know that in that high chamber of the Tooth Fairy's castle, one assassin fell out of the story he had tried to control. One old terror slipped thankfully into rest, and the work of minding children's small fears passed to someone who knew exactly how large fear could feel. Outside, somewhere above the freezing rooftops, Death in a red coat drove on through the night, unaware that the foundations of belief had just shifted under his sleigh. The castle exhaled. The teeth shone. For the first time since I had woken in a puddle of other people's mistakes, the ache in my head eased by a fraction, as if the world itself had swallowed and decided for the moment not to be sick. Leaving the Tooth Fairy's castle felt like stepping out of a dream that had decided to keep one small piece of you as payment. The white corridors folded themselves away behind us. The door to the low room where the last bogey had lain closed without a sound. In the main hall, Banjo took up his post with a gravity that made his ridiculous crown look almost regal. "You'll mind the teeth," Susan told him. "You'll see that no one frightens children here unless it is strictly necessary." "Yes, miss," Banjo said. He did not ask who would decide what was necessary. That, I supposed, he would have to grow into. The castle hummed approval around him. The teeth knew their new keeper. Then Susan took my arm and the world inverted. It is not a pleasant feeling when your constituent atoms decide to commute all at once. Walls turned inside out. Floors became ceilings. The sense of up and down flickered like a dying candle. For a moment there was nothing but darkness and the taste of frost. When things settled, we stood not in a castle of stories, but in a landscape older than any tale told beside a fire. Snow lay in a wide, unbroken sheet. The sky hung low and colourless, as if the world had run out of blue. Black trees, leafless and sharp, clawed at the pale air. The silence had weight to it. This was not the emptiness of a forgotten room. It was the held breath of something waiting to see which way the story would jump. "This," Susan said quietly, "is where the original bargain lives, the Hogfather's first home, before toy departments and sugar pigs and cards with smiling faces, before anyone thought to put a jolly man in red between midwinter and the fear that the sun might simply not bother coming back. Across the snow I saw movement. At first it was only a shadow between the trees. Then it resolved into forms, lean shapes, low to the ground, running in a pack. They had the look of hounds and something colder, their edges too precise, their mouths too empty. Each breath came out as a little puff of numbers. Above them moved taller figures in pale grey coats, riding on horses that barely touched the ground. The auditors of reality had put on shapes again. They rode like men who had read about hunting in a book and decided to try it once, for the principle of the thing. Their faces were careful, almost polite, and utterly without interest in anything except the correction of an anomaly. Ahead of them crashed something huge and dark. The Hogfather ran as a boar. Not the sensible domestic sort that can be coaxed with a bucket, but the kind that haunted the first campfires. His body was a slab of bristle and muscle, his tusks curved and ancient. Snow steamed under his hooves. Every breath he took turned the air red gold for an instant, as if he carried a memory of summer in his lungs. He was not jolly. He was necessity. He was the demand that something be given up so that light would return. The hounds bayed. The auditors leaned forward. If they brought him down here, where he had first been born out of fear of the dark and hunger, he would not simply die. The story that said a midwinter feast ends with dawn would come apart at the roots. The world would still spin, of course, but the sun would rise on a universe with one less promise woven into it. Susan tightened her hands on the poker. "My grandfather is trying to keep things going from the outside," she said. "We will have to do something barbaric from the inside. It is a peculiar thing, watching a governess walk toward a hunt. Her steps were neat, as if she might scold the snow for being untidy. As she advanced, the air around her grew sharper. Shadows bent away. The hounds hesitated in their run, puzzled by a presence that would not fit in their calculations. The nearest auditor reined in his horse. His borrowed face was smooth, but unease clicked around him like tiny abacuses. "This is an enclosed narrative," he said. "You are not permitted here." "I teach children," Susan replied. "I go wherever their stories begin to break." She raised the poker. Against the grey-white world, its iron looked very small. Behind it, in her eyes, something very large and very old peered out, measuring. Humans think of death as final. They forget that for some beings, he is also family. The first hound leapt. Susan swung. The poker met the creature in mid-air with a sound like a bell being struck and a plate shattering at the same time. The hound flew sideways, dissolving into a whirl of cold sums and falling snow. The pack skidded, suddenly remembering they were not required to enjoy this. The auditor on the horse stared. "This is not your function," he said. "You are an anomaly, too." "Probably," Susan said, "but I am on the side of the sunrise. You may have had a moment like that in your own life, though perhaps with less snow and fewer cosmic bookkeepers. Someone tells you that you do not belong in the place where you are standing, in a job, in a conversation, in a choice. You know that by some neat definition they are right. You also know that if you step back, something important will be left undefended. What you do next is one way a life is drawn." Susan stepped forward. The poker glowed faintly, as if it were being remembered as a different sort of weapon. Two more hounds lunged. She struck them down, each time disrupting not flesh, but intention. The Hogfather crashed past us, breath coming in hard gusts. For a moment his small red eyes met mine. There was nothing kindly in them, nothing grandfatherly. He was an animal at bay, cornered and furious. And yet there was something else behind that. A burden, almost, of all the little notes and offerings ever left out in hope. It occurred to me, absurdly, that gods feel pressure too. We speak of them as if they were finished sculptures. Perhaps they are more like costumes worn over something older, heavier, more confused. The auditors regrouped. You could almost see the calculations. Hounds failing, hunt disrupted, variables unequal. The simplest solution, from their perspective, was to remove the interfering human. 2 of them stepped down from their horses. The shapes they wore blurred at the edges, struggling to hold. Underneath, something colourless seethed, offended by the weight and mess of a body. They advanced on Susan. I am not, by nature, a brave god. I exist because people wake up wishing they had been wiser. My job is to watch them clutch their heads and promise improvement. I am not built for heroics. But even a small god can reach a point where watching is no longer bearable. I stepped between Susan and the nearest auditor. It regarded me with a sort of chilly distaste. Anthropomorphic leakage, it said. Toxic side effect. You will not be required once the festival is corrected. I am required now, I said, surprised to find the words in my own mouth. Because they still drink. Because they still make bad decisions. Because in the morning they still want someone to blame. You tidy the universe and they will only make new messes. It tilted its head. For a moment, in that blank gaze, I saw a kind of incomprehension that came very close to fear. Not of me, of what I represented. The refusal of humans to behave like numbers. Behind us, the Hogfather stumbled. The hounds closed in again. Their teeth were not meant for flesh. They were meant for symbols. They tore at the idea of the boar, at the accumulated weight of centuries of winter offerings. Susan looked from the pack to the animal and then back to the poker in her hand. "This is going to hurt," she said softly, mostly to herself. She ran, past the auditors, who had not quite adjusted to the notion of being ignored, through the spray of cold breath and flying snow, straight toward the Hogfather. He lowered his head, tusks flashing. For an instant it seemed he would gore her. Then, at the last moment, she swung, not at the hounds, not at the hunters, but at him. The poker struck. There was no blood. There was only a flare of red gold, bright and painful, expanding outward from the point of impact. The boar's great shape shuddered and came apart into a storm of sparks, each one the memory of a feast, a wish, a child's delighted gasp. The hounds howled without sound, as the quarry they had been told to define simply ceased to fit their definition. The sparks rose. For a heartbeat they formed the outline of a man, broad and laughing, with a belly like a sack of presents and eyes like reflections of hearth flames. Then the shape stretched, thinned and shot upward, toward a sky that had been waiting all this time for something to ignite it. Far off, very far, a rim of light appeared where the horizon should be. It was thin, fragile, the palest yellow line. It grew. The auditors reeled. This was not in their tables. The quarry was gone, and in its place a function they could not politely erase. The ancient, messy business of a sun that rises because people have arranged themselves to expect it. One by one they let their human shapes fall away. The hounds dissolved into cold arithmetic. The riders blurred into smoke, and then were nothing at all. Already another part of the universe was calling them with unsatisfactory totals. The snowfield softened. The trees lost their knife edges. In the distance, the rim of light thickened into the promise of dawn. Susan stood alone in the freshening grey, poker now only iron again. Her breath smoked in front of her. "You killed him," I said, "unnecessarily." She shook her head. "He was always meant to die," she answered. "Winter needs a story about something dying so something else can live." I just made sure it was the right something at the right time, but we still wonder whether the tales we tell about necessary sacrifices are wisdom, or merely excuses we give ourselves for not looking too closely at who exactly ends up on the altar. Death's realm folded around us then, bringing with it the familiar chill and the distant ticking of timeless clocks. Somewhere below, children turned in their beds, clinging to the last scraps of Hogswatch dreams. Somewhere above, the sky brightened along its edges, feeling for the shape it was supposed to take. The Hogfather, old and new, had done his part. So had Death, in his borrowed coat. So had a governess with a poker, a big man with a paper crown, and, improbably, the god of what happens the morning after. The night had chosen to end. Dawn is a slow thing at the edges of reality. In Death's house, it arrives not as light through a window, but as a subtle change in the ticking of clocks. The sand in the hourglasses seems to hesitate a little less on its way down. The shadows grow sharper, as if remembering that somewhere there is a sun to cast them. After the snowfield and the shattering of the hunt, Susan and I stood once more in that long dark hall. The great rows of glass gleamed faintly. Each hourglass hummed with its own quiet trajectory. The Hogfather's glass, which had been a volatile thing, glowed steady now, a new layer of jolly myth wrapped safely around an older, more dangerous core. Death himself returned in a swirl of displaced cold. The red coat hung from him like a memory that had not finished settling. Frost rimed the edge of his hood. The fake beard drooped. He carried the sack with the exhausted air of someone who has done a great deal of heavy lifting in the moral sense. "It is done," he said simply. Susan looked as if she wanted to argue with that, on principle. But even she could feel it, the slight loosening in the fabric of the world, as if a tension line had been retied instead of snapping. Children would wake to stockings with something in them. The sun would come up. The universe had agreed for another year to go along with the story. "Almost done," she said. "There are still them." The word was vague, but Death understood. He always knows where the sums do not quite add up. "Yes," he said, "the auditors." If the Hogfather was a story about midwinter and hope, the auditors were the footnote at the bottom of the page, reminding everyone that none of this was strictly necessary. They preferred a universe where nothing unexpected ever happened. They had tried, that Hogswatch, to tidy away the fat man in red as one more needless complication. They had failed at the hunt. So they tried something worse. You cannot understand mess without touching it. That is the lesson they had been slow to grasp. Somewhere in their chilly collective, a conclusion formed. Perhaps they would be more effective if they knew, from the inside, what made humans so stubbornly untidy. They began to take bodies. I felt it first as a new flavour of headache. It was not the usual throb of excess. It was a sharper pain, like ice being chipped with a chisel, somewhere very high above the city. In the streets of Ankh-Morpork, Hogswatch morning stirred. Children yawned and stumbled toward fireplaces. Paper began to tear. Parents feigned surprise with varying degrees of success. Carts rattled as merchants set up stalls full of things people did not need and had already bought. And at the same time, in quiet corners and high ledges, thin figures paused in wonder at the simple experience of breathing. An auditor in borrowed flesh stood on a balcony overlooking the city. He flexed fingers, marvelling at the complexity. Tendons, joints, skin. Every movement fed back into a cascade of sensations. The body reported constantly, too bright, too cold, too loose, too tight. The coat scratched, the shoes pinched. The heart, that inefficient pump, insisted on sharing its every beat. It was appalling. It was intoxicating. He took one step, then another. The weight of boots on stone sent tiny shocks up his legs. Wind tugged at his hair. A smell he could not identify drifted from a nearby bakery, warm and thick. Hunger, that other new thing, sat up inside him and took notice. This is why they are so irrational, he thought. The data never stops. In another part of the city, an auditor in a different borrowed body moved through Crumley's toy floor. Yesterday he had watched death in a red suit disturb the place's tidy cash flow. Today he followed the paths of customers, trying to map their choices. A child picked up a toy and hugged it. Face transformed. The auditor noted the change in expression, the flush of colour, the little gasp. He felt, to his horror and fascination, a faint echo in his own chest. The toy was meaningless. It served no purpose. Yet something in the messy human mind attached enormous value to it. He reached out and picked up an identical toy. The fabric was soft, the stitching uneven. It smelled faintly of dye and sawdust. Holding it did nothing to alter the laws of physics. Yet the body he wore reported a tiny easing of something undefined. This was unacceptable. He put the toy down. His hand did not agree. It lingered a moment too long. Elsewhere, an auditor learned about fear. He had taken the shape of a watchman on a high tower because it seemed efficient. Height gave a wide field of view. From here he could observe Hogswatch behaviour and note deviations from the expected. He did not intend to step too close to the edge. Edges were trivial. Then he did step too close. A loose sliver of snow carried his foot a fraction further than planned. The body pitched forward. For a sick instant the world spun. Stone, sky, stone, sky. His stomach lurched. His heart slammed against his ribs in a flurry of outraged percussion. Hands grabbed him from behind, hauling him back. "Careful, mate," the other watchman said. "It's a long way down." The auditor stared at the drop. It stared back with sudden, terrible individuality. If he fell, it would not be an auditor falling. It would be him. His particular heart, his particular limbs, his particular collection of unfiled experiences. The possibility of non-continuation wrapped itself around his borrowed spine and squeezed. he discovered that the human body named this sensation terror. It changed him. You could almost hear the click inside as the idea arrived. I do not want to fall. That was the danger. Bodies came with pronouns pre-installed. A collective cannot afford pronouns like that. As Hogswatch Day unfolded, more of them tried wearing humanity. They intended impartial research. Within hours, they were slipping. One discovered that eating was not only a chore. Certain substances produced complicated feedback loops in the pleasure centers. He drank more to chart the effect and discovered that the effect charted him. Another found herself distracted by the precise way sunlight fell on snow, how it made each flake briefly visible before melting. She stood in the street, staring at the gutter, while something in her chest tightened with a sensation that had no immediate purpose. Beauty. A third sat in a tavern corner, listening while men described the lives they might have had, if certain small things had gone differently. The auditor came to the logical conclusion that alternative paths were statistically irrelevant. Yet his hand, without authorization, clenched around the mug as he wondered, absurdly, what he himself might have done if he had been born as this body, rather than wearing it for an afternoon. But we still wonder whether any of us, given a chance to observe life from a safe distance, would really choose safety once we had tasted even a single flawed, vivid moment inside it. Death watched this with something that might have been amusement and might have been something darker. He and Susan stood in a space between moments, looking down at the city like surgeons over an overcrowded operating table. They cannot help themselves, Death said. They wanted to understand us, Susan replied, so they became us. And now they are learning what it means to have a self. One will discover lust, said Death. Another will discover greed. A third will discover fear. And they will not like any of it, Susan said. No, Death agreed. They will find it inefficient. He did not sound sorry. He did not sound pleased either. Death, unlike the auditors, had spent a long time watching humans be ridiculous and magnificent by turns. He knew that you cannot take on flesh without paying in confusion. One by one, the borrowed bodies failed their experiment. An auditor, driven by hunger for food, forgot to count and ate until his heart gave out. Another, tasting the sharp thrill of surviving a near fall, went back to the tower edge again and again, until the probability caught up. The one in Crumley's, who had held the toy too long, found himself shouting at a manager over a sale sign, outrage blossoming where calculation should have been. His human chest clenched so hard around the injustice that the borrowed heart tore. From my peculiar vantage, I felt each collapse as a brief, bright flare of excess, followed by nothing. They were not drunk, those auditors, but they fell afoul of the same trap that fills my temples every morning, mistaking immediate sensation for sustainable truth. In the quiet after, the collective that was left pulled back in disgust. Bodies were filed under not a recommended tool. The report on humanity was updated, dangerously addictive. Death let them go. Taking them apart permanently would have been easy for him, but in their way they had already punished themselves more thoroughly than he ever could. Down in the streets, Hogswatch meandered toward evening. People ate too much. They laughed too loudly. They promised things they might not keep. They hurt each other's feelings without meaning to and mended them clumsily with leftover pie and awkward apologies. They believed, inconsistently, in the Hogfather, in the future, in their families, in the chance that next year they might do better. And I, who had begun the night as a side effect of their excess, watched them with something new stirring under my headache. It was not quite respect. Respect implies a tidy ledger of merit and fault. It was more like recognition. The auditors had stepped into humanity for a moment and fled from its noise. I was born from that noise and, against my better judgment, had helped to keep it going. The day wore on. Outside the city, the sun climbed through a washed-out winter sky, looking, as it always does, exactly like itself, and nothing at all like a jolly fat man in red. Inside the city, people lit lamps anyway, as if they were helping it along. For the moment, that was enough. If you live off the consequences, you develop an odd relationship with causes. I had spent my very short divine career watching humans collide with the morning after. They staggered through my domain clutching their heads, swearing they would be better, and then, inevitably, finding a reason not to be. At Hogswatch, I began to see the scaffolding that holds the whole structure up. After the auditors retreated from their disastrous tour of humanity, the world wobbled and then steadied. People shivered for no reason, thought briefly of falling or choking or losing something important, then went back to stirring gravy and arguing over whose turn it was to wash up. In Death's house, consequences never get lost under the table. Hourglasses that had trembled on their shelves stood firm again. The Hogfather's glass glowed with a new layer of story. Not just an old boar dying in the snow, but a man in red climbing down chimneys, smelling faintly of soot and sausages. Susan stood with her hands folded around each other, watching the sand. "So that is it," she said. "We keep the fat man in the red suit so the sun will come up." "Yes," Death said, "and so that other things will be possible." He turned to her, blue gaze bright behind the skull. "Humans need practice," he went on. "For what?" Susan demanded. "Practicing to believe in what? You cannot expect me to admire a universe that runs on lies about gift wrapping and stockings. They are not quite lies, I thought. They are metaphors you can put brandy butter on." Death gestured, and the hall around us thinned. For a moment we stood nowhere in particular. A patch of darkness, a dusting of snow that did not melt, a low horizon waiting for a story. "When you are small," Death said, "you believe in little figures. The Hogfather, the Tooth Fairy, the Boggy Man." Images hung briefly in the air. The tusked boar, coins sliding under pillows, a shape crouched under a bed frame. "They are training devices," he said, "little stories." "And when we grow," Susan said slowly. "When you grow," Death answered, "you must learn to believe in things that only exist because you say they do." New scenes formed. A courtroom, its wood worn smooth by hope and disappointment. Two hands clasping in a promise. A small crowd holding candles against the dark. "Justice," Death said. "Duty. Mercy. Rights. None of those are nailed to the sky. None of them burn hydrogen. They are agreements, stories so stubbornly believed that they begin to change what actually happens." "You cannot cut them open," Death said. "If you look with only numbers, they vanish. But they still matter. He looked at his granddaughter, who had spent years learning to see the world sensibly. Children must first learn to believe in the small, impossible things, he said. Otherwise, they never learn how to hold the big ones. Susan's jaw clenched. So we tell them about a man who knows when they are sleeping, she said. We put coins under their pillows. We pretend to be something we are not. And you call that training. She did not like the answer. That did not mean she thought it was wrong. Death inclined his head. What else do you suggest? He asked. Should we tell them from the beginning that the universe is mostly vacuum and indifference, that no one is keeping score? That would be honest, Susan said. Yes, said Death, but not very helpful. Silence stretched. The hourglasses went on sifting, measuring lives spent on shopping lists, lullabies and hopes that the next Hogswatch would be better organized. They live as if someone is watching, Death said more quietly. It helps. Susan closed her eyes. When she opened them, some of the anger had worn down into something heavier. Responsibility, perhaps. I teach children, she said. I am supposed to tell them the truth. Tell them, Death said, that stories matter. Tell them that promises matter. Tell them that it is possible to choose to be kind even when no one is counting. He paused. And if you must, tell them that once, on a very strange Hogswatchnight, their governess hit a god with a fireplace poker so that they could go on waking up to full stockings and sunrises. The corner of Susan's mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile. I am not putting that in a moral lesson, she said. They would only try it on their brothers. Death turned to me then, as if remembering I existed. You also have a part, Bilious, he said. I do, I said. I stand at the end of the party with a bucket. And you listen to their regrets, Death said. It was true. My temples are built of broken promises and sore heads. People clutch themselves and swear they will change, that next time they will drink less, speak more gently, go home earlier. Most of them will not keep those vows. A few will. You are their first attempt at repentance, Death said. Their practice at wanting to be better. It was an unflattering job description. It was also, to my irritation, not entirely wrong. I thought of men and women on Hogswatch morning, sitting in messy kitchens while burned fat clung to the curtains, whispering, I will do it differently next year. Most of them would not, but some would, and they needed somewhere to send that first wavering intention. But we still wonder whether the small, uncomfortable moments when we admit we have gone too far are enough to shift the vast machinery of what we are, or whether they are only little lights we turn on briefly against the dark. In Death's Hall, as the last traces of the stolen Hogswatch settled, I began to suspect those little lights mattered more than any auditor's tidy ledger. Crooked and unreliable, yes, but real in the only way that counts for creatures who insist on waking up and trying again. Very well, Susan said at last. We keep the Hogfather. We keep the teeth and the tooth fairy. And, apparently, you. She looked at me. Do try to make some use of your domain, she added. If they are going to wake up feeling like death, it would be nice if something came of it. I will do my best, I said. It was not a promise. Not yet. But it was, I realized, a beginning. The day after Hogswatch is my busiest time. It is also the only day of the year when people are just sober enough to suspect that some of what they feel has nothing to do with drink. The mind is tender then. It is open to the idea that perhaps certain things have gone too far. I woke properly this time in a room above a tavern. Someone had put me to bed. This was unusual. Gods are not generally tucked in. We tend to be left wherever the prayers drop us. The room was small, with a sloping ceiling and a window that looked out over crooked rooftops. A cracked basin sat on a table. A pitcher of water waited beside it, beaded with cold. Someone had left a slice of bread and a small dish of salt. I recognized the gesture. It was the kind of offering people make when they are not entirely sure to whom they are offering, only that they owe something somewhere. I drank the water. It did not cure the ache in my skull, but it moved the pain from unbearable to familiar. The bread steadied my stomach. The salt tasted of waking up and trying again. Downstairs, the tavern was in the throes of morning after. Chairs stood on tables. The air smelt of stale beer and new determination. A boy with a mop tried to persuade the floor to forget what it had seen. The landlord moved slowly, as if his joints were surprised to still exist. He glanced up as I came down the stairs and frowned for a moment, as if trying to recall exactly when he had rented the extra room. "You're the one from last night," he said. The sickly-looking cove the lady in black brought in. That would be Susan, governess, hero, unwelcome meteor in the lives of monsters and small gods. "She said," the landlord went on, "that you had had a rough time and needed a quiet corner." He hesitated. "She also said I was to give you this." He pushed a small object across the bar. It was a little metal token, roughly stamped with a symbol that looked like a mug and a sunrise. "For when they come in," he explained, "the ones who say, 'Oh God, never again.' She said you might want to keep count." It was a ridiculous thought. I am a god, not a clock. And yet, as I turned the token over in my fingers, something in me settled around the notion of tallying, not just suffering, but the moments when people admitted, even briefly, that they wanted to change. "I will," I said. Outside, Ankh-Morpork wore its hangover like a battered crown. Hogswatch decorations drooped. Someone had left a paper lantern floating in a gutter. In the light of day, its cheerful face looked a little strained. A man sat on the steps of his shop, head in his hands. His apron was spattered with yesterday's gravy. Smears of soot marked his cheeks. "Never again," he muttered. "Not like that. All that shouting, and the little ones crying, and me throwing the plate." He trailed off, wincing at a memory sharper than his headache. I sat beside him. Gods are not obliged to ask permission to sit. "Bad Hogswatch," I said. He groaned. I told myself I'd be jolly this year. Make it nice for them. But the oven went wrong, and the stuffing burned, and then my brother turned up with that look on his face, and I drank. And then I said things. They weren't Hogswatch things. He glanced sideways at me, eyes bloodshot with more than lack of sleep. "They'll remember, won't they?" he asked. "The children. They'll remember me shouting, not the presents." "Yes," I said, "it is not my business to lie. But they will also remember what happens next." He blinked. "Next," he echoed. "You could apologize," I suggested. "You could make them sausages for breakfast. You could tell them the oven was the first mistake and you were the second." and you intend to fix at least one of you." He stared at his hands. They were big hands, reddened from work, capable of breaking plates and mending toys. "You think that helps?" he asked. "I think," I said, "that the worst hangover is the one you pretend you do not have." He snorted and then, to his own surprise, laughed once. It sounded rusty, like a door opening again after a hard winter. "All right," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "All right, I will go buy more sausages." He paused. "And less drink next time." "Keep the second part," I said. "The sausages are optional." He went off toward the market, walking like a man who still expected to be forgiven and had not entirely accepted that it might be possible. I watched him go and felt, faintly, a new kind of tally mark scratch itself somewhere in my attention. 1. If you have ever sat on the edge of your own bed after a bad night and decided, quietly, that you will try to do better, you have made one of those marks too. They are small. They do not glow. No one claps. But they are real. Later, I wandered through other corners of the city. In a narrow alley, a girl sat with her back against a wall, tracing circles in the dirt with a stick. She had drunk nothing stronger than watered beer, but her eyes had the distant look of someone who had heard adults say sharp words over her head. "You all right?" I asked. She shrugged. "Ma'am says Hogswatch is for children," she said. "Dad says it's for fools." They argued. They forgot the pudding. I went to bed. "And what do you say?" I asked. She thought about it. "I think," she said slowly, "Hogswatch is when you find out whether people mean it." "Mean what?" I prompted. "When they say they love you," she replied. I did not have a divine answer ready. Sometimes the only honest response is to sit with someone in their doubt. We watched the snow turn slowly to dirty ice. "You know," I said at last, "even if they got it wrong this year, they can try again next year." She snorted. In that way Ankh-Morpork children do when faced with sentiment. "Grown-ups always say that," she said. "Still, I suppose it's better than if they said they wouldn't." She stood up, brushed off her skirt, and squared her small shoulders. "I'm going to see if there's any pudding left," she announced. "Maybe they didn't burn all of it." I watched her march back indoors as if she were storming a small domestic fortress. Another little mark, perhaps. 2. By afternoon, I found myself drawn back toward unseen university. Wizards make excellent customers, from my point of view. Their relationship with moderation is theoretical at best. The great hall was quiet. The faculty had retreated to their own rooms to sleep off the feast, leaving Ponder Stibbons alone with Hex and a cup of cooling tea. He looked exhausted, in the earnest, blinking way of someone whose hangover is mostly intellectual. "We logged the belief fluctuations," he told me, without preamble. "We have charts. The creation of minor deities peaked around midnight and fell sharply after. You are still here, though." "I am stubborn," I said, "and there is still work." He regarded me thoughtfully. "I could try to model you," he said. "Work out the parameters. Perhaps we could reduce the incidence of your, necessary presence by educational campaigns about sensible drinking." "You could," I agreed. "Or you could accept that some things cannot be completely removed, only steered." He sighed. "That is what the Arch-Chancellor says about students." Hex ticked and hummed behind him, gears moving in patterns that tried very hard to be elegant. A little sign on it now read, Anthropomorphic Output, Stable. Another, newly added in Ponder's tidy hand, said, Do not attempt to delete Hangover God. I saw what happens when they try to make life tidy, I said. They put on bodies and fall off towers. Ponder winced. I read the reports, he said. There are some phenomena you cannot study from the outside. We sat for a while in companionable silence, listening to Hex think. But we still wonder whether the discomfort we feel after our mistakes is punishment or a gift, and whether gods, like me, are jailers, or merely witnesses to the moment when people decide that the next story they tell about themselves will be a little different. As the pale winter light slanted across the hall, I turned the metal token from the tavern between my fingers. I thought of the man buying sausages, of the girl braving the remains of burnt pudding, of wizards promising, for the 100th time, that this year they would stop at the 3rd bottle. I was undeniably a ridiculous god. My temple was any room with more bottles than sense. My prayers were groans. Yet, walking through the city in the long day after Hogswatch, I began to suspect that my purpose was not just to count regrets, but to stand quietly at the edge of them, pointing in the general direction of better. It was not much, but for a newly minted deity built out of other people's overindulgence, it felt like a start. By the second night after Hogswatch, Ankh-Morpork had almost convinced itself that nothing unusual had happened. The last sausages were gone, the extra bottles mysteriously empty. The quarrels either patched with apologies or pushed carefully under the carpet. Decorations sagged over doorways like tired smiles, waiting to be taken down. The city had put its festival face back in the cupboard and was already reaching for its everyday mask. Most people never see past that surface. For them, the tale stops with presents opened, leftovers eaten, and the sun rising twice in a row, as if it had done so entirely by itself. The machinery behind it all, the levers made of fear and hope and old stories, slips back into the dark and waits for next year. That is how it is meant to be. In Death's house, Hogswatch was being put away like a complicated game. The sleigh rested in the stable, its runners still remembering rooftops and chimney smoke. The great hogs slept, vast flanks rising and falling in a rhythm older than language. The red coat hung patiently on a hook. The beard lay folded on a chair, an ordinary scrap of cloth, now that belief had stopped stretching it into something larger than itself. Death sat at his desk in his usual black. The lists before him had nothing to do with dolls or toy swords now. Names, dates, endings, all in steady columns. He attended to them with the same careful attention he had given to small children who wanted drums and picture books. Souls leaving the world, children entering it, the slow traffic of existence, all passed under that vast, impartial courtesy that is the nearest thing he has to love. Susan was back in the ordinary world, which never quite fits her any more. In her employer's nursery, the fire burned low, bright enough for reading, but not dramatic enough for revelations. She sat on her straight-back chair and read stories aloud, tales in which wolves stayed on the page and princesses behaved themselves. The children leaned against her skirts, comforted by the measured calm of her voice. One of them asked very softly, whether the Hogfather really did visit every house. Susan hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then she said that he visited every story, as long as people remembered to make room for him. It was not the neat answer of someone who believes only in facts, nor the wild assurance of someone who believes in everything. It was the kind of truth that has learned to live between those two. In the Castle of Teeth, Banjo walked his rounds. The white corridors did not look quite so harsh now. The shelves of little boxes shone with a gentle pearly light. When he passed, they chimed a faint greeting, like china cups touching in a careful toast. He had help. Other shapes moved in the corners, remnants of bogies who had once waited under beds and now preferred to wait beside them. They took their work seriously. Teeth were counted, polished, tucked where they should be. Coins were stacked and sent out along the threads of belief, slipping under pillows with the quiet precision of a well-practiced promise. Children never saw Banjo. They only felt the result, a gap in the mouth that hurt a little less because a coin waited in the morning, proof that someone had noticed a small loss and thought it worth answering. The best guardians are often the ones no one ever learns to name. As for me, I discovered that being a god is not only a matter of soaking in other people's misery. It involves, annoyingly, decisions. I went back to the tavern where Susan had left me and asked the landlord if I might help for a while. He gave me a cloth, showed me the barrel taps, and told me how to tell when someone had clearly had enough. So I learned the small, sacred art of saying no. The first evening was quiet. People trickled in by twos and threes, drawn as much by company as by drink. Jugs passed along the bar. Someone started a tune that had once been a carol and had now become an ordinary song about winter and wanting to be warm. I listened to their talk. Beneath the laughter and boasting there was always the same soft underlayer. Regret disguised as humour, fear disguised as irritation, hope disguised as loose plans for next year. A man at the end of the bar told his friend he would never drink like that again. His voice carried the weight of every year he had made, the same vow. This time, though, there was a different hitch in it, a small, stubborn edge. His hands shook when he said it. He looked, not at the empty mug, but at the door where his children had waited the night before. He said that he meant it. His friend rolled his eyes and laughed. I did not. Quietly, where no one could see, I counted 1. That is how I keep tally now, not of cups or groans, but of small turns toward kindness. When someone chooses an apology over a second bottle or a quiet word over another silent hour by the fire, I count it. Yet I have seen what happens when the big stories shake, and I have learned to trust the tiny hinges they swing on. Later, when the tavern had sunk into its soft, late hush, I stepped outside. Frost glazed the cobbles, and the city lay still. Overhead, the sky was full of hard, indifferent stars. The universe does not care whether you hang tinsel or slip coins under pillows. It will go on expanding, empty and cold, with or without your fires. You care. You drink too much and wake full of shame, yet inside that shame, a thin, bright line of intention can still say that next time you will do better. So when your own long night comes and you wake with regret heavy on your tongue, remember this Hogswatch I have spoken of. Remember that you are allowed to try again, to step one breath nearer to gentleness, to light one more small lamp against the dark. And if, in that quiet moment, you whisper to the empty room that next time you will do it better, know that somewhere a rather foolish god of hangovers is listening from the shadows and quietly hoping you are right.